Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and kick this off. Thank you to everybody who's joined. I am Mary Petrick with the Nuclear Energy Institute, and I will be your moderator for today's program. I want to welcome everyone to this virtual event of the Global Nexus Initiative, focused on the climate imperative for decarbonization and the contributions from nuclear power. We have a great lineup of speakers this afternoon. A few quick announcements about the webinar itself. Participants will remain muted throughout the event. You all will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the question pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time, and I'll address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentations. Today's webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email with a link to view the recording. I hope you all will take the time to explore the work of the Global Nexus Initiative Working Group on the GNI website, including reports and past events. They'll be described in depth in a moment. And with that, I would like to introduce two speakers representing the partnership that is the Global Nexus Initiative. John Kotek is Vice President of Policy Development and Public Affairs at the Nuclear Energy Institute, the policy organization of the nuclear technologies industry. And Ken Luongo is the founder and president of Partnership for Global Security, an organization working and innovating at the convergence of security, technology, and economic issues. So first to John for some opening remarks, and then to Ken for a deeper dive into the Global Nexus Initiative's work over the past 5 years. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Mary. Thanks to all who have joined today's event, and a big thanks to the team at the Partnership for Global Security for their collaboration over the last 5 years. The Global Nexus Initiative remains a powerful mechanism for creating synergies between the industry, the non-proliferation community, and other non-governmental groups. In particular, the GNI Working Group and the products it has published have laid out the urgency for responsible action needed to achieve decarbonization goals in the coming decades, and has set forth recommendations on technology and policy pathways to ensure nuclear energy is a key element in a clean energy future. This work has helped lay the groundwork for the conversation we're having today, which truly is a timely one. Because we at NEI are seeing unprecedented levels of commitments, whether it be from large energy end users, from state legislatures, or from utilities themselves, to dramatically reduce carbon emissions and move to a cleaner energy future. We're also seeing a growing body of expert analysis that's showing the need for firm, dispatchable, carbon-free generation like nuclear if we're going to decarbonize affordably and reliably. And finally, we're seeing incredible momentum in the development of new nuclear energy technology in the form of both private investment and public support. For just a couple of examples, the recent announcement of the DOE grant to support the Carbon-Free Power Project, which is being led by UAMPS in Idaho to build an SMR. The recent announcement of awards for the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Project, and of course the progress we're seeing at the NRC in terms of moving forward with more risk-informed regulatory reviews for next generation of innovative reactor designs. So tremendous progress on multiple fronts, and we're going to hear more today about this momentum, and also about the growing consensus about the imperative for a clean energy future. We at NEI are most pleased to be a part of this discussion, and we thank you again for your participation today. And now on to Ken for more on the Global Nexus Initiative. Ken?
Thanks, John, and thanks, Mary. I want to thank NEI for being our great partner in the Global Nexus Initiative. And I also want to thank the MacArthur Foundation for supporting the project and also this event. GNI embodies PGS's and NEI's belief that today's complex global challenges and political realities demand a new level of real-world collaboration between innovative and non-traditional partners. Changes in the global landscape have made it essential that there be an evolution in the relationship between government, the private sector, and civil society stakeholders. Hyperpartisanship and the persistence of single-issue silos have damaged the leadership capabilities of the United States at home and abroad, and it has impeded the creation of innovative pathways to new policy formation. GNI has been the pioneer initiative to address the intersection of three critical issues: climate change, the evolution of nuclear technology and its deployment, and the importance of maintaining and improving global security. GNI is a unique project that began as a first of its kind initiative between two non-traditional partners, the Nuclear Energy Institute and my organization, the Partnership for Global Security. GNI is designed to identify solutions to some of today's most vexing transnational issues by bringing together a cross-section of diverse international experts. At the core of the initiative is a working group which is comprised of 20 accomplished multidisciplinary international professionals. They have policy expertise in nuclear technology, operations and markets, energy policy, law and regulation, international diplomacy, nuclear security policy, international project development and finance, climate change, and global security. The members currently represent the United States, Canada, Europe, and Asia. And throughout the project, the working group has been supplemented with additional subject area and regional experts to provide fresh ideas and new perspectives. This initiative began as a 2-year experiment, but its long-term value has been proven. As a result, this type of mold-breaking collaboration is becoming more commonplace, more important, and more productive. The challenges of the 21st century are different from the last century. Issues once effectively addressed in narrow silos of expertise are increasingly interconnected with other challenges. This creates the need for new collaborations, policy innovation, and the creation of common objectives. For GNI, nuclear energy, climate change, and global security represent a critical issue and policy development nexus. Just to give some examples, global energy demand and populations are increasing, particularly in the developing world. Climate change is impacting all nations and its ravages are increasing. Nuclear power is expanding to new regions and countries. There is a very real threat that the nuclear market of the mid to late 21st century could be controlled by authoritarian governments, Russia and China. And nuclear proliferation and terrorism remain high priority global security concerns. GNI seeks to address these critical issues by identifying the best approaches to ensuring the safe and secure use of existing and new nuclear energy sources, support clean economic growth, and protect people and the environment. I'd like to just run through a few of GNI's accomplishments. I think, Mary, if someone could put up the slide, thank you. GNI has been operating for over 5 years, and as you can see from the graphic, I just want to highlight a few of our achievements. In 2015, when we first began, we published a detailed evaluation of the role and responsibility of nuclear power that analyzed in depth the role of nuclear power in addressing climate change. In 2016, we released a framework for advanced nuclear reactor deployment that identified how to rapidly move nuclear technologies from concept to deployment. In 2017, we published Evolving Nuclear Governance for a New Era, which focused on how nuclear governance can keep pace with technology advances. Later that year, we released Nuclear Power for a New Generation, addressing energy, climate, and security challenges, which brought together the key issues of nuclear power, climate change, nuclear geopolitics, and the importance of non-traditional partnerships in addressing them. Then in 2019, we published Advancing Nuclear Innovation, Responding to Climate Change and Strengthening Global Security. This was a groundbreaking analysis of the safeguard security and geopolitical implications of advanced reactors. A version of this document was accepted for presentation by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and it has become a touchstone for others working in this area on new analysis that have been built on top of its methodology. This report also was cited on a short list of suggested reading in the Department of Energy's April 2020 report, Restoring America's Competitive Nuclear Energy Advantage, a strategy to assure nuclear national security. The last two GNI reports also won graphic design awards for their creativity and effectiveness in presenting the information. So going forward, the pandemic has obviously curtailed the planning of everyone's events and gatherings, including ours. So GNI has decided to engage with its collaborators and partners through virtual means. We have today's event, and we're planning another one for early December, and I believe we'll continue to do these into 2021. These engagements, whether virtual or in person, will focus on 4 themes. 1, supporting decarbonization with a focus on the role of nuclear power in collaboration with other clean energy technologies as a means of meeting global clean energy demand and climate objectives. 2, strengthening geopolitical competitiveness with the objective of strengthening nuclear export positioning of the United States and its allies and preventing authoritarian governments from dominating 21st century global nuclear supply. 3, prioritizing innovation and technology with a particular focus on next generation technologies and the support systems that are required for their advancement. And 4th, leading on global security and governance by advancing strong security, safety, non-proliferation systems that are essential for operating and expanding nuclear power programs. We're hopeful that our analyses and recommendations can help guide the next U.S. administration and global policymakers in productively addressing the interrelationship between climate change, nuclear energy, and global security. Please visit www.globalnexusinitiative.org, where you can find all of our latest information. Thank you.
Thank you, John and Ken. I have had the pleasure to be involved in the GNI project since the beginning, and it has been a great forum to dig into these big, complex issues and cement some really diverse relationships based on working towards solutions. So thank you for that great overview. I'd now like to move to our 3 main presenters today. First, we have David Victor, Professor of International Relations at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego, who will be setting the foundation for this discussion with his presentation, Quantifying the International Imperative for Deep Decarbonization. David?
Excellent, thank you very much. Can you see me?
I cannot see you at the moment.
Let me get,
but I can hear you.
Okay, well, that's maybe good. Okay. Oh, here we go. Okay, how's that?
There we go. Great. Welcome, David. Thank you.
Well, my main contribution so far has been to push the right button or the wrong button several times and the right button once. So I'm going to stop pushing buttons. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you and to share some of my thoughts about the challenge here. I care about carbon, and when you care about carbon, you have to be attentive to all major sources of low carbon or zero carbon energy, and nuclear power is part of that mix. And it's a mix that's getting a lot more competitive, and I think that competition can be healthy for the industry if the competition is managed well. So I have 10 minutes or so, and I want to try and make 4 broad points about the international imperative here and the quantification, how big the challenge is going to be when your goal is to stop warming. So the first comment I want to make is about emissions levels. A little hard to talk about this in a pandemic where emissions are 7.5%, 8%, going to be 7.5%, 8% lower than they were last year, thanks to the economic cratering. And there's already signs they're going to come back. And so the fundamentals on the ground haven't changed very much. But the experience in the pandemic year gives you some sense of what is required, because prior to the pandemic, emissions were going up 0.5%, 1% per year, and we were actually thrilled with ourselves because that rate of increase was lower than during the recovery from other periods of economic malaise. For example, after the Asian financial crisis, the global economy bounced back very quickly, and we saw one of the most rapid growths in emissions ever clocked in the modern industrial era. In the period since the 2008 financial crisis, we've seen a slower growth, but still growth nonetheless. Stopping warming requires the opposite, requires deep cuts in emissions, essentially to zero, probably also negative if you really want to stop warming, given all the carbon that's accumulated in the atmosphere right now. And something on the order of 80% cuts in emissions over the next couple of decades, and 100% over the next 2-3 decades. And if you want to stop warming faster, you have to accelerate that timetable. If you don't mind a little more warming, you slow down that timetable. But frankly, all of that is the opposite of what we've been doing so far. So think of the scale of the challenge as making an emissions reduction comparable to what we've done during the pandemic, but for good reasons, because we're focused on economic growth and policy and decarbonization, but nonetheless continuing that emission reduction. I am deeply skeptical that we're going to do that. I think we're in for a whole lot of warming as a result of that, but we still have big choices in front of us, because you can have a whole lot of warming or a whole lot of warming. And those are the kinds of changes that are in front of us. I don't think the goals that have been discussed in Paris, 2 degrees, are feasible. 1.5 degrees is pixie dust and unicorns on the streets. But what we're really talking about here is avoiding 4 or avoiding 5. And that requires near-term investment in technologies that will diffuse into service in an industrial system whose metabolism is on the order of 2 to 3 decades, if not longer, for change, which means that if you want to be at that position mid-century, you need to get cracking on the problem right now. And I think so far the ratio of talking to doing around climate has been very, very high, because there's a whole lot of talking and the denominator, not zero, the denominator has been small. But that's the kind of scale of the challenge needed here. So really, really big challenge in front of us. Second of the 4 things I want to talk a little bit about is how to think about this as an international problem. Climate change is caused by the accumulation of mainly carbon dioxide, not exclusively carbon dioxide, but mainly carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And it's what we often call a stock pollutant. So what matters is the accumulation, regardless of where it's emitted on the planet, but the accumulation over time. And that's a really important geophysical point, because it tells you then a lot about the politics and about the sensitivity of the climate to changes in policy. An example, my colleagues run a measuring station on the top of Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii. I've always been a little skeptical that they're really out there measuring carbon dioxide. I think they're out there surfing, but they've been measuring this since the 50s. And the measurements of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have not noticed that we're in the middle of a global pandemic, not statistically noticed inside the noise that's normal in the carbon cycle. And that's because this buildup, this stock buildup, means that you have to do a whole lot sustained for year after year after year before the climate actually notices what you've done. And the bigger challenge, I think, politically, is that there are now places in the world that are doing a lot. I'm in California, we're doing a lot in California. The blue parts of the US are doing quite a lot. A few days ago, a team of us at Brookings released a study looking at the 100 biggest cities in the country and what are they doing? Half of them are doing nothing, but the other half are doing actually quite a lot with varied impacts and so on. So that's a start. There's a huge program in Europe to invest in deep decarbonization. The highest carbon taxes we see in the world are in a handful of European countries, including Sweden, Norway, Switzerland, a couple of others. Big initiatives in Japan, big initiatives now in China is particularly interesting. The 2060 zero goal for emissions from China is a serious goal. There's serious efforts behind that. So there's actually quite a lot happening right now. To me, as someone trained originally in political science, and in particular in the field of international relations, what's really striking about this is that the portions of the global economy that are doing a lot, or have been doing a lot over the last few decades, remain a small fraction of the global total. So if you rewind the tape of history back to the year 1990, when international negotiations around climate first began, back then, something like a third, or maybe a little more than a third of global emissions were coming from the countries that would be reliable leaders on climate over the subsequent 3-decade period. What happened is the reliable leaders, countries and jurisdictions, about half of the United States is in that category, maybe 2/3 of Canada. What's happened is that the leaders have done a lot. And so their emissions slowed down and then they reversed, whereas the other countries in the world, the other jurisdictions in the world haven't. And so they've become a bigger part. And so ironically, the kind of core political logic of the climate problem is, ironically, the more you do as a leader, the less directly relevant you become to the underlying problem because your emissions shrink and you become a smaller share of the global total. Why do we care about this? Why does the nuclear industry care about this? Because the nuclear industry, like any other deep decarbonization industry, has to develop a strategy whereby what it deploys in the places that are pioneers, that are doing the most, is replicable, is scalable outside. Because if you're a pioneer in the carbon business, you're thrilled with yourself because you're a pioneer, but being thrilled with yourself is not good enough because the problem ultimately is a global problem. It requires diffusion of the technologies pervasively ultimately through the entire global economy, certainly all the large emitters. So an awful lot of what we do to advance low carbon technologies, and this is true of nuclear, it's true of advanced renewables, and so on. A lot of what's done in those industries must be evaluated not just through the lens of whether they make economic sense for the pioneers, but also whether they can be replicated and scaled and are being actively replicated and scaled throughout the rest of the global economy. I think that's particularly important for the nuclear industry because the geopolitics of nuclear equipment supply, reactor supply, fuel, and so on, those geopolitics have shifted quite a lot. I'll talk a little more about that just at the end of my remarks. So that's the second thing that I wanted to say is we need to recognize that the geophysics of the climate problem tell you an awful lot about the political strategy that's needed, strategic efforts that are needed, so that the places in the world that are actually doing a lot, that those leaders find some followers. The problem for climate change is a little less of a leadership problem and a lot more of a followership problem, if that's a word. The third thing I want to talk a little bit about is the role of nuclear power, in particular around electrification or energy carriers. I'm an academic. Academics are not in the agreeing business. Nobody wins a Nobel Prize by agreeing with everybody else. You win prizes and you get recognition by disagreeing. So we kind of disagree with a lot for the most part. One of the places where almost all of the academic work around deep decarbonization agrees is that an economy that decarbonizes is an economy that electrifies, or an economy that shifts more of its primary energy to electricity as an energy carrier before its final consumption. Maybe doubling the quantity of electricity consumed in modern societies, maybe bigger. Some people think we can electrify everything. I think those folks right now are maybe smoking and inhaling a little too much good product, but maybe we'll be able to electrify everything. My guess is that we're going to have a combination of electricity as an energy carrier and hydrogen as an energy carrier. Nuclear power potentially has a massive role to play in both. Electricity, that's an obvious case. Hydrogen, through high temperature steam reforming and so on, might end up playing a big role for the high temperature gas cooled reactors or other kinds of technologies. We'll see, maybe also via electrolysis and other applications. But I think what's interesting about nuclear power and this logic of decarbonization means a shift to energy carriers and electricity first and foremost is that nuclear power sits at the center potentially of all of that. But I want to make a brief, and other speakers are going to talk about electricity and the options and so on. I want to make just two remarks about this though, which are kind of blind spots, if you like, I think for the industry right now. One is that the next frontier for nuclear power in at least Western grids is going to be a bigger role with helping to integrate renewables, where it's highly likely that the grid of the future is going to have a whole lot of renewables in it, maybe more renewables than we would think of as optimal when we think about just the cost questions. But nuclear power is going to play a big role in helping to integrate those renewables. You see this already on some grids, like the French grids, where you're running reactors up and down during the day in ways that they were not originally designed to do, but the industry's kind of figured a lot out. You see this in some of the reactors on PJM and a variety of other places. Small modular reactors could end up playing a very big role here. And that's interesting and resonates with the comments made earlier by the role of clean, firm power, of which small modular reactors in particular could end up playing a really big role. So I think the industry needs, especially in the West, to really pay closer attention to the renewable nuclear interplay, because that's going to be both politically and from an engineering perspective a key part of the future. The other thing I'd like to say about this, though, is that in addition to shifting to electricity as an energy carrier, pretty much all the models suggest that the economy that decarbonizes is an economy that capitalizes, meaning it's shifting to a much greater role for capital expenditure as determining the future of the energy system and away from operating costs, from fuel costs and so on. Why do you care about that? You care about that because in a world that's capital intensive, the cost of capital determines everything. And the industry has to demonstrate that it is part of an ecosystem that stewards capital effectively and has very low costs of capital, because the more you can do, almost on a basis point by basis point perspective, the more that the technology becomes much more viable in its contribution to deep decarbonization. Last thing I'll say, just very briefly, is about the international landscape for nuclear technologies. We've seen this huge shift in the industry over the last 5-6 decades, away from local gear, so national gear being applied in national markets, American producers applying American gear in the American market, French producers in the French market, Japanese producers in the Japanese market, with international ties and so on, but basically a whole set of national markets emerging in parallel to an international market. I think the industry has to pay closer attention to that and whether and how that resonates with the emerging political debates about what's safe, what's geopolitically wise, and so on. I'm very concerned that the international market right now is dominated by Russia. The Chinese are coming behind quickly. Done well, the Russian and especially the Chinese models could be viable in the Western countries' interest, but that's only going to happen if there's competition. And so in my mind, the most interesting nuclear project in the world today is the Korean-built project in Abu Dhabi, because done well, it's going to demonstrate a Western-style design and application that is a model for the future. And that competition, the geopolitical competition, getting that right is going to be essential to getting the global problem of climate change handled properly. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, and really appreciate that compelling narrative really about the size and scale of the emission reduction challenge we're facing, and also some of the international context around not only the data, but the solution pathways as well. Thank you. I do want to transition quickly. Building off this foundation, I'd like to introduce Armand Cohen, co-founder and executive director of the Clean Air Task Force. Armand is also a formal member of the Global Nexus Initiative Working Group and has been a great supporter of GNI from the beginning. So thank you for that, Armand. Armand will walk through what a credible combination of technologies looks like to address this decarbonization challenge, and will also describe some of the international policy initiatives underway to reach those goals. So with that, Armand, thank you.
Thanks, Mary. So I'm not sure I have an optimal or completely credible platform here of what the solution set looks like, but I think it's important to start out with a little bit of humility, and I'm going to echo a little bit of what David said about the scale of the problem and how the building blocks might fit into that. So let's start with a couple facts. We're looking at a world, presumably after the pandemic subsides, and it will subside, in a world that's going to need to increase its total energy supply by as much as 50% over the next several decades. Now, that may even be conservative. If you look at a country like Nigeria, which may be the third largest country in the world by population by mid-century, and assuming some increase in wealth and demand, the numbers may be even higher. But let's take 50% as a mid-range. We've got to grow the total energy supply on the planet by 50%. And we have to decarbonize all the existing supply, and all that new supply needs to be carbon free. So piece of cake, right? Now, the other fact that I want to drill into a little bit, and David sort of hinted at this, is that we really have two problems. We have an electricity problem and we have a fuels problem. Only 25% of the energy on the planet is consumed today as electricity. 3/4 of it is consumed as a gaseous or liquid fuel for transport or industry or for building heat. Now, we may electrify a lot of that. Let's say we doubled that amount, or that percentage, we'd be at 50% electricity, 50% fuel, but there's that persistent issue there. So I'm going to return to that in a minute and talk about nuclear's potential role in that part of the equation. The third fact is that 80% of global energy right now is coming from fossil fuels. That has been completely stubborn as a number over the last 30 years. It hasn't moved an inch, even as we've increased renewable share and to some extent nuclear in the early part of that period. We're still been stuck at 80% For electricity, it's somewhere in the 60s, low 60s fossil, but there's still a lot of fossil obviously running on the system. So this transition is not going to happen overnight. The question I was asked to address is, what's a credible answer? How do you decarbonize that 80% remaining of the energy system that is fossil fuel? And if we just focus, most of the studies that have been done on this have focused on electricity, and they're all pretty similar. There are a couple outliers, but most of them say basically there are 4 pillars that you can use to decarbonize electricity. One is you can decrease electric demand or reduce the size of the problem through energy efficiency. Number 2, you can use renewable energy of all kinds, whether it's hydroelectricity, which is the dominant renewable used for the electricity system on the planet right now, or wind or solar or biomass, which is in a separate category, or geothermal. Nuclear energy, which today provides 10% of global electricity, is an option. And then I wouldn't say technologies, but rapidly commercializing technologies that strip carbon out of fossil fuels, carbon capture and utilization and storage. And while that industry is sort of at its beginning stages, there are commercial demonstrations around the world, and the International Energy Agency and others have constantly highlighted that. So you have whatever study you look at, with exception of some studies that would argue that we can do everything with wind and solar and batteries. We won't get into that. Maybe in the Q&A we can talk about what assumptions underlie those studies. But most of the mainstream studies are assuming that one needs a mixture of options to reliably do the electricity sector. But again, that's 25% of the total. And let's say we increase that to 50% of the total. You've got the remaining 50% to worry about. But even within the electricity grid, most of the studies that have been done on this have said, well, you know, what are the issues there? Why are we looking at a mixture of things? And a lot of work's been done on that. One issue that's been mentioned as to why we might want firm, clean generation in the mix is the problem of variability. If we rely only on a wind and solar grid, for example, we have not just a daily problem of low demand, but or low supply, but we have a seasonal problem. And if you look at the supply curve from combined wind and solar systems that have been modeled all over the world, anywhere in the northern hemisphere, this may be a little different near the equator, but anywhere in the northern hemisphere where most people live, you get really multiple weeks, even months, where combined wind and solar output is very low, maybe a factor of 2 or 3 less than it is at its peak. So managing that level of variability requires either almost a zero-cost storage system, which is maybe we'll get, but is not in view at the moment, or massive shifts in demand by weeks, not just hours. The other assumption that underlies those studies, which is increasingly getting attention, is the amount of land required. Wind and solar are very land consumptive, maybe by a factor of 30, 40, 50, maybe even 100, according to some studies, as compared with more compact generation. It's a very crowded world, especially where people live. That's a little bit of a tautology, but if you look at places like India or the coastal regions, where most people live, it's crowded, it's hard to place infrastructure, and that's a non-trivial problem. So all of these concerns have led most of the people who've looked at this topic, and as I said, there are outliers, to conclude that having some firm, clean generation in the system, whether that's nuclear or some kind of utilization, typically of gas with carbon capture and storage, or the manufacture of hydrogen from any number of sources, whether it's renewable or nuclear or from carbon stripped out of natural gas, put into a turbine is essential to maintain reliability at some reasonable cost. So that's the general literature on this topic. Now, I'd like to, that's electricity, okay? So, but let's talk for a moment about what happens and how much you complicate the problem if you go beyond electricity and you think about the total energy system. And I want to put up a couple of pictures really quickly. And Mary, I'm not quite sure how to do that. I don't know if I
will make you the presenter, Armand.
All right, and I'll see a button somewhere, hopefully, allows me to do something. Okay, so where is that button?
It should be coming.
Okay, there we go. Okay, would like to capture this computer screen. Got to open system preferences. Of course, you always have to open system preferences. Here we go. All right. Okay, great. All right. So let's see. So I'm going to show. Are you seeing a picture here of? Are you seeing a map here by chance? No, did that not work?
Not yet.
All right. It says that it's showing my screen. It says not showing anything. That's interesting. Okay, show what? Let's see.
Oh, there we go.
All right. So I want to credit my colleagues at Lucid Catalyst, which recently did a study of hydrogen supply options globally. And this is a picture of the amount of land area and ocean area that you would need in order to displace oil demand in the UK. And the magenta is if you supply, and I realize these are idealized cases, but in the magenta shows the total land area that would be required from in the offshore if we were to do that with wind, which is the preferred wind location in the UK. And the orange area is what would be required if we did this all with solar PV. So you can see that there's a non-trivial land and space issue associated with a solely renewable pathway. Now, if we were to only do electricity, you know, and just ignore the fuels entirely, those areas would be reduced by roughly 2/3. But it's still a lot of real estate, and we can have a long discussion about how realistic we think it is that citing that amount of generation and transmission is. This leads you to kind of think, well, maybe what is one of the advantages of nuclear? Well, maybe one of the advantages, maybe the signal advantage of nuclear is you can produce a lot of power in a small amount of space. And you actually, when you want to scale it, you can do it quickly. So for example, France decarbonized its grid within a space of a couple decades, essentially 80% decarbonized through nuclear. Ontario and Sweden, through a combination of nuclear and renewables, did the same thing. So when you want to do it, when you can actually make this work, you can at least do the grid. But maybe the model we have to think about for the nuclear industry is a much more condensed sort of form of deployment. And I'll talk about the business model associated with it in a second. This is just a picture. It's obviously an artist's conception of what a concentrated coal nuclear production center. Again, this was produced by our colleagues at Lucid Catalyst, which did a recent report that I really commend to you called The Missing Link. And this particular configuration would be 36 small modular reactors on a single site. You would need 4 of these sites to provide all the electricity to the UK. I'm not suggesting that that would be a wise thing to do, but you could build four complexes of this size. If you wanted to also displace all the oil and gas consumption in the UK, you would build 10 of these. Now, again, there are a bunch of issues I'll get into in a second about actually getting to this business model, but it does suggest, and I'll stop sharing here, that there are some inherent advantages here. Let's see, Mary, am I back now? Has the screen share finished?
Yes, you're good, Armand. Thank you.
Okay. So I think the point I wanted to make simply is that there is a radically different way of thinking about this at the scale that we need. And again, just to think about the scale for nuclear to contribute at a meaningful scale to just the electricity grid. Let's say that we wanted to go from 10% of global electricity to 30% of global electricity from nuclear by mid-century, assuming a 50% growth rate or growth in demand electricity. We need to go from 410-ish gigawatts that we have right now of nuclear to something like 2,000. So, you know, roughly a 5-fold increase. How are you going to do that? And then if we wanted to do that to have a meaningful contribution to the oil and gas displacement through electrolysis or through high temperature steam reforming, one would need a build of nuclear somewhere in multiple thousands. So this is really a radically discontinuous approach. So my final message is that if nuclear is really going to make a major contribution to mitigating climate change, we're going to have major change in how we think about nuclear power as a force and as a business model. We have to move from essentially what is stick-built projects. And while I appreciate what David said about the UAE project, that project still took basically 12 years from conceptualization to realization. And we're talking about what is it, 4 or 6 gigawatts of that period of time. It's great. It came in right at budget, or even under budget, as I understand, but still, that's not fast enough. We're building tens of gigawatts a year of nuclear. To get to the kind of numbers I was talking about earlier, we need hundreds of gigawatts per year over the next few decades to make a meaningful difference. And that's just a radically different model, maybe something like what I just showed you, with a mass-produced product rather than a project, a commodity. And that will require very different thinking by the global nuclear industry. Maybe it will require a completely different nuclear industry than the one we have today. Maybe it's much more an industry that's capable of thinking like oil and gas, deploying hundreds of units, or the aviation industry that turns out several hundred, something like Boeing or Airbus, which turns out 700 airframes a year. We have to think in those terms and at that scale. That's also a different regulatory model. We need a globally regulated product. We need a globally standardized product, or maybe 2 or 3 or 5, but not 30. I guess my final message here is nuclear shows up in the models as a important linchpin of a decarbonized energy system. But if that's going to be real, we're going to have to change our thinking dramatically, especially as we think about addressing the non-electric markets, which are the majority of energy consumption. So thanks, Mary, I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Armand, for walking us through a lot of the optionality involved with various technologies. And I really appreciated your remarks about, again, how we think about nuclear. Our work at GNI, and certainly your remarks here, have shown us really the immensity of the problem. And especially when we're looking at larger electrification issues, really demands that all solutions must be on the table. And with that, I would like to move to our final speaker for today. I'd like to introduce Jason Grumet, President of the Bipartisan Policy Center. The presentations today have laid out the problem and a lot of the tools we can use to address decarbonization. Jason's now going to focus a little bit more on the context of the United States and what a credible roadmap looks like to address emissions reductions. I also want to remind our attendees we have the question function open in the platform, and I will be opening up the Q&A following Jason's presentation, so feel free to submit questions when you can. So with that, Jason, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mary. So both David and Armand led off their presentations talking about humility, and I'd just like to note that I've been asked 6 days before a change election to project the future of American climate policy. So this is either a demonstration of my affection for GNI or lack of strategic judgment that I am now taping these projections. But hey, welcome to Washington. So I am going to try to give you a little bit of a sense of what I think the future could hold for climate policy as it relates, obviously, to the nuclear industry. I'm going to focus mostly on the what if the polls are right and Biden is president and we have a Democratic Congress. Obviously say a few words about what happens if some version of the status quo is extended. Just to kind of start at the end, I would tell you that the future for the nuclear industry is extremely bright. There is going to be a dramatic move towards decarbonization. As you've heard Armand and David discuss, there's going to certainly be a focus on electrification and some real progress in the last couple of years, such that now nuclear is in the family of climate solutions. That is not true across the board, but I would say that the dominant voice in the climate advocacy community now recognizes the essential role that nuclear power is going to play, and it is being grouped more and more in the kind of most favored nation status of decarbonization technologies. So the future is really bright. The present's pretty bleak. In the best circumstances, the ideas I'm going to share with you will start to really gain traction in an economic sense in the next 2 to 4 years. And as many of you on this webinar know better than I, those are going to be some tough years for nuclear power, right? So I think a little bit of the question here is, to what extent can the existing fleet hang in there while U.S. carbon policy starts to shift in a way that actually acknowledges the economic benefits of non-carbon energy? So let me say a little bit about the status quo. If the Trump administration gets a second term, I think that you're going to continue to see an awkward support for nuclear power, kind of so long as it is grouped with coal. And we all saw that effort take a couple of different courses, but where we've kind of landed, if we had a continuation of the status quo, is the action basically being between FERC and the states. The most unfortunate phrase, minimum offer price, MOPR, is basically a federal effort that seeks to kind of neutralize the benefits and support that a number of states have tried to provide for non-carbon energy. I think that continues, although there'll be litigation. At the same time, the FERC has actually indicated that it has the authority to approve a carbon price. So, that's where the action would be if we have kind of a continuation of the current politics. Assuming that we move to a democratic control of the US government, and so few people are ticket splitting these days, that is to say, pretty much people are voting party tickets across the line. So if Biden were to win the presidency in any convincing manner, it is very likely that the Senate would also flip to Democratic control. So we're going to kind of imagine what that might look like here for a little while. So President Biden is fine with nukes. He doesn't have like an abiding love like he seems to have for fracking. But Joe Biden understands that nuclear power is part of the energy solution and sees it, I think, clearly as part of the climate solution. I believe that you would see the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission kind of turn around these recent policies, though it probably takes about a year for them to do that. When President Biden shows up in office, he would start with a very aggressive executive set of actions. So there will be probably a kind of day one recommitment to the Paris Agreement. There'll be a raft of executive orders undoing a whole bunch of President Trump's executive orders and making lots of rhetorical and I think meaningful commitments to a new direction. But the real question is what happens with the legislature. I think many people have come to recognize that the president alone can't really do that much for energy policy. It matters, but not probably as much as you would assume if you listen to what the candidates say on the debate stage. You need to have Congress engaged, and Congress is going to be very engaged if, in fact, you have unified control. There are kind of two metaphors for action. So it is our view that there is not going to be a standalone climate-focused legislation, at least initially, in a Democratic administration. I think there will be significant climate policy driven through two metaphors, one being stimulus and the other infrastructure. And a lot of what I think will be relevant to nuclear power can kind of fall into one of those two buckets. These are not kind of hermetically separate ideas when you're talking about trillions of dollars on the table. But if we kind of start in with stimulus, I think it is extremely likely that there will be a stimulus package early in a Biden administration. I keep feeling I have to say hypothetically, but we're just going to go with that hypothetical. I think it's important. The timing will depend a little bit on whether Congress passes anything in this kind of lame duck. I mean, the stimulus package is not going to be driven by energy policy. It's going to be driven by unemployment insurance, healthcare, the basic kind of needs of small businesses, providing PPE equipment to schools and hospitals. And it is likely that there will be an energy component along the way. To get some sense of the scope of that, Vice President Biden is quite fond of talking about his role in the last stimulus, the ARRA, which, if my memory serves, was a $787 billion exercise, so small ball by today's standards, with $90 billion described as being committed to clean energy. So that's about a 12% ratio. If we're looking at a $3 trillion kind of HEROES Act type stimulus bill, you're talking about $350 billion of clean energy investment. Now, just to give you a sense of scale, the vice president has committed to a $2 trillion overall package, so this would be a down payment. But the basic message is there'll be a lot of money flowing towards clean energy, and I think nuclear power will be able to play in that mix. Now, the question is what? If things move fast, ideas are going to have to be pretty mature. I think you would see some expression of the Nuclear Energy Leadership Act, which has moved forward, but not far enough, but that would probably be on steroids. I think there is the opportunity for advanced reactor demonstration projects. I mean, we would be talking about more than just infusing money into the DOE Office of Electricity. This would be a 5x to 10x increase in domestic investment in energy innovation. I think that an infrastructure package is likely to pass. I think that it is likely that it could actually have bipartisan support. Obviously, it will depend on what's in there and how the election turns out. There's also likely to be an infrastructure package. Infrastructure legislation is the best idea that never happens. If one does the after action report of the first 18 months of a Obama or Trump administration, people will say they should have done infrastructure. I think that there will be a big push towards infrastructure legislation. Again, the question about where the nuclear industry can play in that space, it depends on, I think, this notion of critical infrastructure. And so, the notion that the existing fleet has both national security and critical economic value is something that I think GNI has spoken a lot about. Notions about a investment tax credit for the existing fleet, I think, could be on the table. Something we haven't talked about in a long time, used fuel. That's a pretty classic infrastructure question. I think you could see some new attention there. There's gonna be a lot of focus on permitting. I think there's a growing recognition that the scope and scale of our climate challenge is not matched by a facile and efficient regulatory permitting system, and that we simply are gonna run out of time if we don't find some way to responsibly accelerate the ability to build big things. And so I think you can see quite a bit of discussion around permitting, which obviously has a significant impact on the pace and the costs of new nuclear facilities. So there'll be a lot of action. I won't go into much more detail, but the first 9 months of 2021 would be, I think, quite energetic from a spending federal money on technology and infrastructure standpoint. Just two more things I'll touch on. There'll be a lot of talk about carbon tax. Some people are going to want to call it a carbon fee, but guess what? Everyone else is going to call it a carbon tax. There will probably be legislation introduced in the Senate with some bipartisan support that will set a marker for a carbon tax, probably with some kind of dividend attached to it. We think that there's very little chance that that gets serious consideration. As a general rule, I think it is unlikely that we are going to impose a couple $100 billion a year tax on the economy while we are in a grinding recession. I think there's actually a risk of the opposite. If you look back to what happened in 2009 and 2010, pretty strong argument that let's get our house in order, let's deal with healthcare, let's deal with the economy, and we'll get to climate next. You're going to hear that happen a lot. But there is this legislative process you've probably heard a lot about called reconciliation, which is designed to enable budgetary measures to move forward with just 50 votes. And so substantively, a carbon tax fits very squarely in the boundaries of what one could do in reconciliation. Politically, we continue to think that it is not likely to be a first move. There are likely to be two reconciliation packages. This gets a little bit tricky, but if Congress does not pass an omnibus budget act in the upcoming lame duck, they could do a quick budget reconciliation. And I think you'd see some tax credits move. That's a place we're going to deal with the debt ceiling. I think a lot of important medium-sized things. There's likely then to be a second reconciliation that probably starts up around the time that the 2022 budget process gets underway, where you're going to deal with the tough stuff. That's where you're going to see healthcare. I think that's where you're going to see if there's going to be any kind of significant changes in the entitlement system that gets considered there. In theory, that bill is going to be so big and ugly that, like, what the heck? You could toss a carbon tax in there, and it's going to be probably a partisan debate either way. But something that is important to realize is if the Democrats have control of the Senate, they will gain that control by electing a number of moderate Democrats. And I think there is a false premise that if you are a Democrat, you vote for anything that seeks to address climate change. I think the 51st vote for a carbon tax is still very much in question at the moment, even if there are 53 or 54 Democratic senators. Finally, in conclusion, the one other policy mechanism that is explicitly climate-based that I think will generate a lot of discussion is a clean energy standard. Most important, and I think I'm not going to argue optimism that that passes while we are still digging out of a recession, but it's going to basically set the stage for, like, who's in and who's out. And the good news is that in all of the considered leading bills right now, nuclear power is considered to be part of the climate solution. Natural gas, despite the president and vice president's enthusiasm for its production, is kind of the issue on the margin. The details are going to matter a lot. How you set baselines and how you credit existing facilities, and there's a lot to be hammered out. But I think the battle over the clean energy standard is important in its own right. I think it also kind of sets the terms of the ongoing climate and electricity debate. And I just kind of end where I started, which is that we are in such a different place than we were 2 or 3 years ago. I think 2 or 3 years ago, it was a very open question about whether nuclear power could be included in a clean energy standard. And I think that is no longer the case. I think the dominant expectation should be that if there's a meaningful clean energy standard, it will include all forms of non-carbon energy and really struggle with how to deal with the forms of lower carbon energy. So that is my prediction, and I ask that all of you forget all of this until Wednesday morning.
Thank you so much, Jason. Appreciate your remarks and the rather delicate position we put you in, talking politics ahead of a major election. Thanks for those comments, and again, I really appreciate, especially your comments again on kind of where nuclear can play. I'd like to go ahead and open up the Q&A. So we're going to bring David back and Armand as well. And so again, a reminder to participants, we have a little bit of time here for Q&A, the remainder of the event here. I'm going to take the moderator slot here and ask the first question, and just stitching a few things together. Jason, you talked about, again, kind of the different avenues that nuclear can play in, especially in context of the policy debate. David and Armand, you all as well talked about different ways nuclear, not only on the technical side, but in other ways working together with different stakeholders. Really in the vein of Global Nexus Initiative, what do you see as kind of the partnerships or types of collaborations that are really needed to further maximize the momentum on decarbonization solutions, both national and international?
David, this is your field.
I don't know about that. So I think we have to grapple actually squarely with the politics that are implied in Jason's remarks about what is the policy instrument we're going to use. Because for a long time, people have been talking about market-based instruments, and that's been great. And then when you look at the real world, what you see is almost all the work gets done by other policy instruments. And it's because the political economy of the market-based instruments is fun in a theoretical sense and then toxic in the real world. And so I think that's a big deal. And I think the industry knows this because they've been talking about carbon taxes and put out press releases and so on. But when you look at the real lobbying work, and it's been around direct incentives, it's been in particular preserving the existing fleet. I think Armin pointed to this, Jason pointed to this issue of how do you keep the existing fleet, at least in the US, alive? I think we're kind of dead in Europe. Japan's a different story altogether. So that I would focus much more on the granular things that actually work, as opposed to the abstract things that are fun to talk about but don't actually seem to work very well in practice.
I could build on one idea there, which David alluded to, which is the relationship between the existing fleet and new technology. Those tend to stimulate different imaginations. I offer an analogy that I don't necessarily think you all should promote, which is if you look at what happened with ethanol when the renewable fuel standard was passed in 2007, it was basically led by the bioethanol, what you could consider the new ethanol people. What it really did was save the old ethanol business, right? I mean, people had great imagination and expectation about the future, and that animated the discussion, and it kind of focused us forwards. But the reality was that it was basically a bridge, and the kind of cellulosic ethanol has not moved forward at the pace that I think most people had expected it would. But that integration of interests was really important, and I think that needs to happen. I think NEI is doing some interesting things to help make that happen, but I think integrating the existing and the kind of new nuclear conversation is something that's not happened quite enough.
Yeah, Mary, specifically on nuclear, I think, again, we have to look at the global situation. Most of the emissions are going to be overseas. Most of the energy is already consumed in the developing world, not the OECD. And those ratios are going to even get larger. So the real question on the table for nuclear is, how do you build thousands of gigawatts in the developing world? I mean, it's pretty simple, actually, in some ways. And then maybe the OECD comes in behind. But the collaboration that's going to be required is an extraordinary effort to bring together first of all, the industry has to get its act together, or maybe we need a new industry that just builds a very different kind of product. It's almost like creating the aviation industry from the ground up, which we did roughly 100 years ago. It's going to require an extraordinary amount of international cooperation around licensing standards. And fortunately, there is some movement right now at the IAEA to begin to look at, some sort of international harmonization of licensing, technical assistance to countries that don't necessarily have a lot of licensing infrastructure capability. And then there's going to be building out the infrastructure within host countries in the developing world to be able to actually site these plants and oversee safety. So that's a whole human infrastructure question. So a lot of collaboration there. We're starting to think about that. Lots of others are, but the 3,000 reactor world or 4,000 reactor world is very different from the 400 reactor world, especially since the geographies are going to be very different. That's a big leap, and there's going to be a lot of actors who are going to have to come together around that. And the pessimist would say can't do it, but on the other hand, we have a pretty healthy global aviation industry, or did before COVID. It'll come back, maybe not quite the same, but we do churn out, license, oversee hundreds of new airframes that enter the market every year, and so that's kind of that would be the aspiration, but that wasn't a trivial matter to get that international regulatory system together either, or that commercial system.
Fantastic. Certainly a lot of opportunity here. Appreciate those comments. I am going to go over, got some great questions coming in the question pane. Here, one question, and I think, and I know a number of you already touched on kind of geopolitics around a lot of this discussion. This is a question, I think maybe David, we'll start with you, but again, I think all of you could comment on it. Question comes in, can you elaborate a bit on what China is doing in both nuclear power and climate policy?
Sure. Yeah. So this is a great example where a lot of people are focused on the visible policies in China, the new cap and trade system and so on, which is frankly irrelevant to effects on the ground. What's really happening is the Chinese have built climate into the middle of their planning system. So they have this new goal of zero emissions by 2060. All reports are there's a lot of spade work going on around how you get there. Will they get there? I don't know. They don't know. In some sense, the goals are getting in the way, actually, of what really matters, which is serious planning about how to reduce emissions, learning along the way, adjusting the goals, advancing them, slowing them down, or whatever, and so on. So what's going to happen is we're continue to see a huge push on diversification of the energy system, in particular electricity, away from coal. I think the era of big new hydro is over, essentially over. Maybe the project here and there, but it'll be away from coal. Coal fleet already has gotten a lot more efficient. That helps explain the leveling off of coal consumption pre-pandemic. And then we're going to see a continued rapid build out of the nuclear side. Some questions have been raised on the operational safety, and they're going to have to pay really close attention to that that issue, and there may be failures, in which case that'll be a setback. And then a lot of renewables, and so there'll be a contest underway between renewables and nuclear as the source of zero carbon emissions in the Chinese grid. But that contest is great for the world, just like the Chinese involvement in manufacturing of solar was great for the world. I think, just one last word here, I think we need to pay very close attention to the institutions that have made the elements of the decarbonization transition feasible so far, because those institutions are not just climate policy. We tend to think about this as climate policy wonks, but they're things like open trade, global sourcing of R&D, You know, the R&D enterprise is now a really global enterprise in the energy business in the way it wasn't 20 or certainly 30 years ago. And similarly, the globalization of the trade and components in other areas, the electricity system has been very, very important, transformers and so on, solar panels I mentioned. But the same could be true of reactors if done well. You have a vibrant global industry. And that, it could be that those factors actually end up playing a bigger role in determining the cost of decarbonization and nuclear's role in that than climate policy per se.
I'm going to stick
David
with
Mail
the,
China.
yeah, that was a great answer. Yeah, no, and I want to stick actually on kind of the international thread here. And I know we've touched on, again, kind of the market and a lot of developing countries coming to nuclear. We had a question from the audience about, again, we know nuclear being a very capital intensive technology. What do you think are some of the potential solutions to this issue, again, internationally, as additional countries look to develop nuclear?
Well, I mean, building things, you know, but if you don't build very much, then the costs don't come down, you forget. You know, it's learning, metaphors kind of a little abused, but very hard to learn if you don't do anything. So building plants, figuring out the supply chains, figuring out, especially in the era we've just been through or going through right now, what supply chains look like and so on. All that's really important to bringing costs down and making the system more reliable, more like the aircraft industry, you know, notwithstanding the occasional glitch that Armin is talking about, and you know, less like a bunch of bespoke projects where if you think about building a project and as a one-off project, then your costs are going to go through the roof. But just one other aspect of the international that I think is really important, ties back to what Jason said. Biden wins, we're going to quickly do the easy things, rejoin Paris and so on. Great. But what really matters is credibility. The rest of the world wants to know whether or not the US is reliably in. And so that's why the politics of what happens in the stimulus, the politics, the role of nuclear and so on, they're so important, because if we screw up the politics, we can imagine some fragile deal that kind of just barely gets over, and then it comes unglued. And that's the rest of the world watching very closely to know whether or not we mean what we say, and that'll have a big impact on these long time horizon technology investments, of which nuclear is one in the class.
Yep. Mary, you know, when sometimes people talk to me about climate finance, I say there is no such thing as climate finance, there's just finance. And,
Yeah.
And the question is, there's lots of money in the world. In fact, tons of it is parked on the sidelines. The question is, money is chasing high return, low risk, right, as much as possible. And right now, nuclear is you know, low return, high risk, because of the problem that we're not building multiple series, we're not learning by doing. You know, even the UAE project is, you know, we'll see if we do more of that. But I really think until we get to a de-risked, standardized, commoditized product, you're not going to see the money flowing. Money has no problem once something is de-risked. So that, I think that's the challenge, and it's unfortunately for the nuclear industry, it's going to be a fundamental business delivery model challenge, which doesn't seem to be in view right now.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to take one more question here, and I think this might be close to our last one. I wanted to touch on the role of the private sector. We've seen a lot of aggressive goals coming out from whether it's large end users, the states themselves, and other things with, again, clean energy goals. How do you see this again pushing? How do you see this pushing the federal, regional levels, even internationally? Is this a backseat driver? Is this really forward-leaning? Just wanted to get your thoughts on that from the private sector.
I can give you kind of a couple of responses. Again, I think it's a little bit back to what David was saying. So these are long-term plays, right? I mean, the problem we have, and I think the problem if we just sneak a kind of 51 vote climate bill through using what seems to be a kind of tricky legislative process, is the expectation that we have changed elections every 2 or 4 years and it flips back the other direction. So I think the importance of a signal, which doesn't necessarily mean a price signal, but a real meaningful commitment, I think matters a lot. I actually think that there is more value than most imagine in a very low carbon tax. I think under $5 you can actually call it a fee and get away with it. And what that does is it allows you and requires you to set up all the architecture. But I've talked to enough people in boardrooms, and when someone makes the impassioned plea, we really got to get in front of this climate thing, someone says, what? There's nothing out there. How can we make a $10 billion investment until there's some federal? And so I think, stamping that the US is in this game and not getting out of this game, I think even if the economic signal is initially modest, I think changes the private sector's response in ways that I think would be much more consequential than even maybe the kind of annualized rational price.
A great point for climate leadership.
Yeah, so I agree with that broadly. I think, to kind of paraphrase Kennedy's moon speech, we do the carbon price not because it is easy, but because it is hard. So you do it, and then it shows you can do something that's hard. So I think in that sense, that'll be a signaling activity. I remain deeply skeptical that market instruments are going to do most of the work. Danny Cullenward and I have a book out Friday in Europe. Somehow it takes 2 months to move books across the Atlantic. It'll be out here in the middle of December. But I guess you can get it on Kindle. So that's something, I suppose, that looks empirically at our actual record with market instruments, which is just atrocious in the carbon area. Not because there hasn't been good thinking, but because the politics are so hard. So I think in addition to the signaling around a carbon price, just anything, have a pulse, would be things like clean energy standards. But I just want to underscore something that Jason said and just carry it a step further. It's fabulous that there's all this private money in the SMR world and so on. I'm really excited about it. It's amazing, truly amazing. And a lot of people are going to lose a lot of money, but they're going to contribute to the planet, and bravo. But the effect of these, especially these merchant plants closing and the kind of on the cusp non-merchant plant closings, the effect of that in terms of a whole generation of US nuclear asset holders is going to be profound, and we got to watch out for that.
Well, I have a minute left, so I'm going to go ahead and just have some quick closing comments. Just want to again thank our speakers for their remarks and the thoughtful discussion today. The imperative for decarbonization and the tools and policies needed to achieve that goal really make the work of the Global Nexus Initiative all the more important in the coming years. And the ability to carve out a forum where diverse interests can come together to exchange ideas and brainstorm solutions, just like we've done today, is really now needed more than ever. So on behalf of NEI and our GNI partner PGS, I just want to thank everybody for their time and participation today. I want to let everyone know that GNI is planning another virtual event in mid-December, and we're planning a webinar on the changing politics of nuclear energy in the US and globally in the context of decarbonization solutions. So watch your emails for that invitation next month, and thank you all again for joining us today. Take care, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you.